You know, an awful lot of the things that go on in Pet Sematary are based on things that actually happen. We moved into a house very much like the house in Pet Sematary when I taught for a year as writer-in-residence at the University of Maine. My daughter was about Ellen Creed's age, and she had a cat. And we were warned about the road, and the Pet Sematary was pointed out to us as a place where a lot of animals who'd strayed into the road ended up. Our cat wandered into the road, and I got a call from the old guy across the road saying, "I think you got a spot of trouble here. There's a dead cat on our lawn, and I think it's your daughter's." And it was.
Pet Sematary began in a very kind of strange place, and in a time, I think, in Steve's career where he was writing at a ferocious pace, but he was also stretching, his abilities in different directions. And this story came to him really in a very simple way. His daughter, Naomi, had a pet cat at the time named Smucky, and Smucky went into the road and was killed. And this put him in that difficult situation, not only of talking with his daughter about her dead cat, which she loved so much, but why those kinds of things happen.
He's not God's cat, he's my cat. But God gets his own if he wants one, not mine. That's right.
This obviously was troubling to Steve, and he was taking a walk across that very busy road, and he remembered a time when their youngest son, Owen, had wandered unattended toward the highway and had given them a scare. And as he walked across the road, it was in that time, he said in that very brief time, that the outline of the book was fully formed in his mind. He set out then to write the book, I think very aggressively. In this outline of the book, there were echoes of The Monkey's Paw, which is a famous short story by W.W. Jacobs, which basically is about a paw that's brought back by a soldier from India that grants 3 wishes. But those wishes always turn out, in a very bad way. There are 3 wishes in this book and in the movie. The first is for the cat to come back, and the second one is for the child to come back, and the third is for the wife to come back, or it's the wish for death. Pet Sematary became somewhat legendary for a time as the book that Stephen King was too scared to publish. There was a certain sort of hype surrounding the book, that it was too frightening to be published. That really wasn't the case. What happened, though, was that as he continued writing the book, a kind of depression settled on him because it was such a dark book. And as a result, he simply put the book in a drawer and didn't really want to see it published. It turned out that in resolving issues that he had with his then publisher Doubleday, the book was offered to them to conclude the relationship that they had. And Pet Sematary was then published in 1983, which was about almost 5 years after it was written.
Setting the scene for Pet Sematary was actually pretty real and pretty easy because I was able to use locations that I had right at hand where I was writing the book. What the story needed was 2 houses that faced each other across a country road. The road's very important because that's where the people and the animals come to grief. And I also wanted to provide a kind of country flavor. These are city people. They're coming to the country for the first time, and I wanted them to feel the contrast between busy city lives and the lives that they were going to live here. And I wanted to contrast the horror against this kind of beautiful setting.
What do you think?
It's gorgeous.
Of course, Ludlow is a fictional town, but it corresponds geographically to the town where I was living when I wrote the novel, a little town called Orrington. But it is just sort of an essence of Maine town. That is to say, there's one road that's a main artery that's busy, that you have to look out for because it carries all the traffic, the heavy trucks and so on and so forth. It's a place where there are a lot of woods, a few houses. There's probably a general store and a little town center. And otherwise, it's a place where everybody knows everybody else, and a lot of people know each other's business, and people get along with each other. A small pocket country New England town.
House has stood empty too long. It's damn good to see people in it again.
When I acquired the rights to Pet Sematary from Steve, one of the requirements was that we make this picture in Maine. And I think that Steve felt very strongly that so many of his books are set in Maine, but none of them had been shot in Maine. And so to bring one home, so to speak, was important. I think it was important from my perspective atmospherically, that in fact the authenticity of the environment adds something intangible to the making of a movie. I think it has been important for the actors in terms of being in Maine, in Stephen King territory, so to speak. And I think that that's a subtlety that shows up in their performances.
How can you call it a good thing? A graveyard for pets killed in the road. I think shooting in the actual area that Stephen wrote about only helps you. In other words, you don't have to be on a soundstage trying to create this air that you're breathing that's so pure and clean, or these leaves that are changing before your eyes naturally. And you get a sense of the area, and you start to behave accordingly to your environment.
I remember shooting in Maine. It was Ellsworth, Maine. Pet Sematary had to be shot there. I mean, Stephen King was right. I remember lots of cemeteries, and you'd see a cemetery, an American flag, a cemetery, an American flag. But it's the perfect setting for a supernatural Stephen King film. You know, the woods are scary. Everything about it is scary.
One thing about Maine that a lot of people don't realize until they come up here is that you can find houses like these on a main road, but in back of them, the country's still pretty wild in a lot of places. And every now and then you'll find a path, usually not one quite as well defined as this, but I found one when I was in the process of beginning this book, which didn't lead to an actual pet cemetery. My idea of the way that a really frightening story should work is a lot like this path. I think it should be a bright, sunny, well-defined place that eventually is going to lead the reader or the watcher into the woods and away from the path, and finally to the deadfall. And the thing about the woods is, you never really know what you're going to find once you get into them. And I was in a woods very much like this, and on a path not very different from this, when I discovered a real pet cemetery, which I incorporated first into the book and then into this movie. And it really wasn't much different from this place right here.
I remember the woods, and at first I found the creepiest woods I could find, and the art department just did an incredible job. There was no acting required when I was walking through that. It was beautiful. You know, it was supposed to be eerie and frightening, which it was, but also it was just beautiful, I thought.
This is the place where the dead speak.
So, naturally, when I found a place like this in the middle of the woods, I was curious about why it was there. And I asked some of the old-timers who weren't very much different from Judd Crandall, the old man in the story, and he pointed to the road. There was a big fertilizer factory down the road, and he said, you know, this road uses up a lot of animals. And the children keep this place nice, and they bury their pets, and this is where they remember them. And I remember the guy telling me that this was a place for the kids where they first really understood what death was and what death meant.
We had to build the pet cemetery from scratch, and Stephen King describes it beautifully in his book. I mean, Biffer, Biffer, a hell of a sniffer, before he died he made us richer. I mean, all those little things that were on the tombstones, he wrote them in the script.
So, do we plant them on the outside of the circle, or do we start a new one?
The place we're going is on the other side of that.
There was no deadfall at the real pet cemetery, but I thought about it, and it seemed to me that maybe this would be the place, sort of the gateway to the sort of things that would go on in the woods beyond. That maybe this would be the place that separated the men from the boys, so to speak. And that if you had guts enough to get up over this thing, your dreams could come true, or your nightmares.
Don't look down, and don't stop.
Oh, you'd find one of these deadfalls anywhere. What this looks like is trash. Trash wood left over from logging operations. They pile up, they become fire hazards, they become animal traps, they're death places themselves. They're snares, traps for the unwary. And of course, you'd have to be crazy to ever climb one, or you'd have to have a real purpose. Anybody who's familiar with these woods here have seen the deadfalls and know enough to either go around them or to stay out of their way. But this one here, if you look at it in the right way, almost seems to have a face buried in it as a warning, which of course is a warning that the people in the story choose to ignore.
What Steve King did in Pet Sematary was indulge some of the kind of beloved tropes of horror stories. I mean, we have the Indian burial ground, which in a lot of people's hands could just be, you know, the worst kind of stereotype, but he takes it in another direction. It has this other explanation. You know, it's this whole notion of something beyond.
What is this place?
I remember the first time I came over the hill and saw the Indian burial ground. It was awe-inspiring. You could sense that there was a power here that could actually bring something back to life.
Building the Micmac Cemetery was earthworks. I mean, we had bulldozers, and that was at the top of a mountain.
It kind of taps into something that makes it feel very special, as though you're at Stonehenge. But being in the middle of those circles, I mean, I didn't have any scenes there. I just went there and to check it out, because everyone on the set was saying, oh, you gotta see the Indian burial ground. And being there, you just, you know, you get this sense of something extraordinary just from these stones arranged in these circles. But it's not so symmetrical. It's such a metaphor for what Stephen King does, you know? It's not perfect. There's something off.
The Micmac burial ground is entirely a fiction of my diseased imagination. But it's a place, I think, that lives in everybody's imagination, where the things that you're the most afraid of and the things that you desire the most, and sometimes those two things are just like that, they're intertwined, where those things come true.